Hey guys, I wanted to do a quick video for you on transportation, but from the point of view of an exam question. So what I've done is I've come up with the question, was transportation a success or a failure? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through reasons for and against, and a little information about the government's views of transportation. Before I do all of that, I'll just quickly review some dates for you so it's nice and clear. The Transportation Act in 1717 started transportation to America as an alternative for execution under the Bloody Code. That ended in around 1776 with American independence. For a short period there was no transportation and prison hulks were used just to hold prisoners. And then in 1787 transportation to Australia became popular, and that carried right up until the mid 1800s, and you can put dates of 1857 or 1868 for the end of transportation. Obviously 1868 is that date that's a really nice one to remember, because you've got the end of public executions, you've got by that point prisons being used, the Bloody Code's pretty much over, so it's just a really nice date to have for you. But there's your dates if you want to pull those into your answer. If you don't know what prison hulks are, just get onto Google and type in, 18th, 19th century prison hulk. Basically, they're old, decommissioned warships that were converted into floating prisons, and they were just used to hold prisoners, and they were horrific. The conditions were bad, as you can imagine. There was no access to, all the things that you needed for clean and safe living, and the idea was that you would just use them as floating prisons, and then when they were full they would set sail to wherever the destination was. Just make sure you know what they look like and that kind of thing, so that if you get a source with them in, it doesn't wrong foot you. So back to our question, was transportation a success or a failure? What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through now the arguments for and against, but before that I'll just talk a little bit about why the government believed transportation was a good idea. So the first reason why they decided to use transportation was that it was seen as less harsh than execution, and this was for the reason that most people who were judges and juries were Christians, and morally it didn't sit well with them to execute people for minor crimes like poaching or cutting down trees or minor theft. They reserved the death penalty for criminals that really needed it, like people that were committing horrific crimes, highway robbers, that kind of thing. That's not to say they didn't execute people who didn't deserve it. Of course they did. It was the Bloody Code. But just remember, the Bloody Code actually didn't see that many executions. Just because they had executions for over 200 crimes doesn't mean that they did it. And transportation was a great alternative. So juries and judges and the legal system's more likely to convict people if there's an alternative to execution. And that alternative was transportation, which was seen as a great alternative. It was harsh enough in the authorities' eyes to act as a deterrent. We won't get into whether it was a deterrent or not. It probably wasn't. People don't really think through their crimes. But anyway, at the end of the day, they thought it would be a deterrent. If you commit crime, you will be transported to America or Australia. They believed that it would reduce crime because it would remove the criminals from Britain, from the country, and that's true. I mean, you stick them on a boat, you send them to Australia, and then those criminals are no longer a problem for you. By sort of a weird sort of offshoot, it helped them to colonise Australia. So by sending our criminals over to Australia, we were able to set up colonies, and eventually Australia becomes part of the British Empire. And then finally, they believed that it would help criminals to reform, because obviously in Australia they'd have to do hard work. So they're the reasons for the government using transportation. And now I'll talk a little bit about the reasons for and against. Okay, so was transportation a success or failure? These will make the basis of your P paragraphs. So reason for is that by 1830, Australia became an established part of the British Empire. So you could argue that yes, transportation was a success because it allowed us to use our criminals to form colonies in Australia and make Australia part of the British Empire. Again, juries would be more likely to convict criminals because they could use transportation as a punishment. So a reason why it was a success is that under the Bloody Code, any judges or juries that were unlikely to convict would be more likely to sentence people to transportation. So it helped the whole criminal justice system to function. Many criminals opted to stay in Australia. So those criminals that you sent away either decided to stay or had to stay because they couldn't afford to return. So it gets rid of your criminals once and for all. Okay, you could also argue as well that to some extent it was a deterrent. There's your reasons for, so that could be 3p paragraphs in an argument, and we'll do the reasons against. So in 1810, the Lord Chief of Justice described transportation as no more than a summer excursion to a happier and better climate. And what he means by this is that to many people, transportation wasn't a punishment. They were being sent to a much nicer country with beautiful weather, and to many people, they didn't see transportation as a punishment. So there's your first reason why it wasn't a success. Secondly, from about the 1850s, gold is discovered in Australia. So how can it be a deterrent if you're being sent somewhere where there's gold? Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. By the 1830s, wages in Australia were higher than in Britain. So not only have you been sent to a country with nicer weather, where you can go mining for gold, you've also got the chances of getting better wages. Finally, the crime rate actually went up during transportation. And actually, by the 1830s, transportation was costing the government around about £500,000 a year. We won't get into what that would be the equivalent of now, but that is a lot of money. Money that could be better spent on different ways of punishing criminals. Okay, so as you can see, personally, I think that the reasons against are more persuasive, and you've got to also bring into this answer the fact that we don't have transportation now. Also, you could bring into your answer the idea that from the 1540s, prisons would be being used more and more, and from 1857 up to the 1868, you've got the end of transportation. Bloody Code is pretty much over. Transportation's finished. We're now using reformed prisons, and you can go and watch videos about Robert Peel and Elizabeth Fry and John Howard if you're a bit rusty on that. But from this period now, we're using reformed prisons, and we're not using the Bloody Code, and we're not transporting prisoners. Okay, so hopefully that has just gone through really what would be a 12-mark explain question maybe. Explain whether you think transportation was a successful failure, something along those lines, and hopefully it's cleared up a little bit of transportation for you.